Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, it's the day that I can finally show you how the GeForce RTX 3080 performs, and as expected, we do have a boatload of benchmark data to go over. There's also a lot of architectural stuff that we could cover as well. We could also explore the Founders Edition design and check all that sort of stuff out, but I feel both of those things could easily warrant their own dedicated video, and I know that most of you really just want to see the benchmarks at this point, so I'm going to quickly go over some of the basic specs and then jump into the results. But before any of that, today's video is sponsored by ASUS and their brand new range of ROG Strix B550 motherboards, many of which we've already tested here at Hardware Unboxed and found to deliver excellent VRM thermal performance. And whatever your needs, ASUS has an ROG Strix B550 motherboard for you, all of which come with a range of AI features such as AI networking, AI noise cancellation technology, and AI overclocking. The B550F Gaming is a particular favourite of mine as it's competitively priced and delivers a strong feature set, including a high quality VRM. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so the new GeForce 30 series is based on the Ampere architecture using Samsung's 8nm process, and Nvidia claims this will provide a giant leap in performance. On paper, the RTX 3080 certainly looks very mighty, packing an insane 28 billion transistors, and that's a 50% increase over the RTX 2080 Ti, previously the world's fastest gaming GPU. Another big change from the Turing-based GeForce 20 series has been made to the streaming multiprocessor, or SM, and its 32-bit floating point, or FP32 throughput. Nvidia has doubled the throughput by designing a new data path for FP32 and Int32 operations, which results in all four partitions combined executing 128 FP32 operations per clock. Nvidia says this helps improve gaming performance, and while true, its effectiveness will depend on a few things which we'll explore in this review. And now here's a side-by-side specification comparison between the RTX 3080, 2080 and 2080 Ti. When compared to the 2080 Ti, we're looking at the same number of SM units with the 3080, but due to the 2x FP32 redesign, Nvidia's claiming a 100% increase in CUDA cores. That specification though can be a bit misleading, as the 3080 won't be 100% faster than the 2080 Ti, but it will offer a reasonable performance uplift. I suppose the point is you can't really make a meaningful CUDA core count comparison between different generations. Something we can directly compare is the memory configuration. Whereas the 2080 Ti received an 11GB memory buffer, the RTX 3080 has been cut down to 10GB, which is quite surprising, and while that's a 25% increase over the RTX 2080, you would expect a larger buffer for a card targeting 4K gaming. That said, the memory bandwidth has been greatly increased thanks to the use of 19GB per second GDDR6X memory on a 320-bit wide bus, resulting in a peak bandwidth of 760GB per second, and that's a 23% increase from the 2080 Ti and 70% from the 2080. It's also worth noting the increase in TGP, or total graphics power, from 215 watts for the RTX 2080 to 320 watts for the RTX 3080, as that is a massive 49% increase, and even a 28% increase from the 2080 Ti. So it will be interesting to see how well the RTX 3080 Founders Edition graphics card deals with all that power once it's converted to heat energy. But enough about all that, it's time to get into the blue bar graphs. For testing, we're using the Ryzen 9 3950X test system, featuring 4 sticks of low latency DDR4 3200 memory operating in a dual rank configuration. I also have some Core i9 10900K and PCI Express data that we'll look at as well, so let's get into it. Starting with Stranding, and here we're looking at a 20% performance increase over the 2080 Ti at 1440p and a 41% increase over the RTX 2080. So that's not bad, but not the 80% I suspect many of you were expecting to see, and I should note that the margins were identical on our Core i9 at 10900K test system. Now, moving to 4K does improve the margins for the RTX 3080, and now it's 29% faster than the 2080 Ti and 62% faster than the vanilla 2080. So that is starting to get up there. Also, 107 FPS on average at 4K is a very impressive result. The game looked spectacular, and as you might imagine, was very smooth. Unfortunately, the performance gains in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 at 1440p are very weak, and this is largely due to our choice to use the 3950X. The game just doesn't utilize Ryzen processors very well right now, and is in desperate need of low-level API support. Here we're looking at a measly 9% increase over the 2080 Ti and 30% over the 2080. But even then, with an Intel CPU, you're still only looking at a 20% increase over the 2080 Ti. Jumping up to 4K does help alleviate the CPU bottleneck, and here the 3080 was 29% faster than the 2080 Ti, which I'm quite sure will disappoint many of you, and please note there is no actual CPU limit here. We saw the exact same frame rates on our 10900K test system, so with an RTX 3080, you're looking at just 40 FPS at 4K when flying over big cities in Microsoft's Flight Simulator 2020. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was one of the games that impressed me the most 2 years ago when testing the RTX 2080 Ti for the first time. The 4K experience really is amazing. At 1440p, the RTX 3080 is seen to be 28% faster than the 2080 Ti and 57% faster than the 2080. So again, probably not the gains many of you are expecting to see, but still, 154 FPS on average under these conditions is very impressive. Then at 4K, we see that 87 FPS on average is possible with the RTX 3080, so that's pretty impressive stuff. And that's also a 67% increase over the 2080 and 30% over the 2080 Ti, so both, again, quite impressive gains, particularly given that this is a $700 US GPU. Moving on to Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, and here we're looking at a 20% increase over the 2080 Ti and at 63% over the standard 2080, or 54% over the Super version. I'm probably not going to reference the 2080 Super too much in this video, given that it only offered a mere 5% increase over the original model, and most of you probably bought the original. Now, at 4K, we're looking at a 29% increase over the 2080 Ti and 71% over the 2080, so those are some pretty solid gains. It also means whereas the 2080 Ti averaged 135 FPS, the 3080 saw 1% lows of 152 FPS, and that'll provide a better experience for high refresh rate 4K gaming. Next up, we have the F1 2020 results, and here we're seeing what's already become a fairly typical 30-ish% boost over the 2080 Ti at 1440p, and this time it's a 29% performance uplift to be exact. That meant the 3080 was 57% faster than the vanilla 2080, so a pretty solid performance uplift there. Once again, we're seeing the margins do grow a little at 4K, and now the RTX 3080 is 36% faster than the 2080 Ti and 72% faster than the 2080, which is a far more significant margin and much closer to the 80% that's been put out there since the announcement. It's also worth noting that we're now talking about 129 FPS on average at 4K. That is staggering performance. Moving on to Gears 5, and here we're seeing pretty mild performance gains at 1440p, just an 18% boost from the 2080 Ti and 37% over the standard 2080. Frankly, those are pretty disappointing gains, especially given we're talking about just a 34% improvement over the now 3.5-year-old GTX 1080 Ti, which also sold for $700 US. Again, increasing the resolution of 4K does help out the RTX 3080, and now it's 47% faster than the GTX 1080 Ti. Not exactly amazing gains given how old the Pascal GPU is now, but it's really not bad either. This time we're looking at a 33% performance uplift for the RTX 3080 over the 2080 Ti at 1440p, so that's one of the better performance gains we've seen at this resolution so far. It also meant the new Ampere-based GPU was 76% faster than the GTX 1080 Ti, which is a significant performance uplift, and we also saw an almost 70% increase over the RTX 2080, so I am very impressed with these results. And of course, they only get better at 4K. Here the 3080 was a whopping 43% faster than the 2080 Ti, and that is a truly massive performance uplift, and it meant the 3080 was 83% faster than the 2080 and 92% faster than the 1080 Ti. So those are obviously some very impressive margins, though they do appear at this point to be a best case scenario for the RTX 3080. With Assassin's Creed Odyssey though, we're back to more mild gains at 1440p. Here the RTX 3080 leads the 2080 Ti by a 25% margin, and the 1080 Ti and 2080 by just a 42% margin. I know it sounds a bit strange to be saying just 42%, but again remember the 1080 Ti cost the same amount as the 3080, it was just released 3.5 years ago. All of that said, we are once again seeing more positive margins for the 3080 at the higher 4K resolution. Here it provided a 35% performance bump over the 2080 Ti, and that meant it was 51% faster than the 1080 Ti and 2080. Though it also has to be said that's one of the lowest gains we've seen at the 4K resolution for the 3080. With no help from dynamic resolution scaling, the RTX 3080 pumped out 190 FPS on average at 1440p in World War Z using the maximum in-game quality settings. So that's a very impressive frame rate, though it is well worth noting that it's only a 17% performance boost over the 2080 Ti and 42% over the 2080. I should also note that while the 3950X does create a small bottleneck in World War Z at 1440p, the margins are virtually identical on the Intel Core i9 10900K test system, moving by just a few percent in the 3080's favour. Of course, as we've seen countless times already now, moving to 4K really does help out the RTX 3080. Whereas it was just 17% faster than the 2080 Ti at 1440p, it's now 34% faster at 4K, and that is a massive improvement, and a bit surprising given that we see the same margins at each resolution with the Intel test system. But we do know why this is, and I'll explain shortly. For now, let's move on to Metro Exodus. And here in Metro Exodus, the 3950X does actually become a bit of a problem. This is a rare instance where the Ryzen CPU does heavily limit performance at 1440p, and as a result the RTX 3080 suffers. That said, I am happy to be reporting this data, as many of you are using a Ryzen processor, and these are the gains you can expect to see at 1440p in this title, just a 25% boost over the RTX 2080. However, I should note that the 3950X doesn't limit performance at all at 4K, so the numbers you're looking at here are identical to those recorded using our 10900K test system. So what we have here is a 35% uplift over the 2080 Ti and 70% over the 2080, both of which are very impressive gains. Now, moving on to the Resident Evil 3 results, where we see an impressive 196 FPS on average from the RTX 3080 when using the maximum in-game quality settings, and that meant it was 31% faster than the 2080 Ti and 66% faster than the GTX 1080 Ti and RTX 2080. So a decent result here. Jumping up to the 4K resolution, and we're seeing just over 100 FPS on average for a 30% boost over the 2080 Ti and a massive 76% improvement over the RTX 2080 and GTX 1080 Ti. So again, impressive gains here, and not far from the 80% I'm sure many of you are hoping to see. Doom Eternal is a game that's been heavily used by Nvidia to show off the RTX 3080 performance, and you'll see why once we move to the 4K testing. At 1440p though, the results aren't overly impressive, as the 3080 was just 20% faster than 2080 Ti and 51% faster than the 2080. Again, I feel 50% is an impressive gain, but it's a far cry from the 80 plus gains we've seen in promotional materials. Now, moving to 4K, we see some interesting stuff using the Ultra Nightmare preset, which in our test sees 9GB of VRAM used. Here the 3080 was 35% faster than the 2080 Ti, but quite incredibly 115% faster than the 2080. Also, it was 93% faster than the 1080 Ti, which does well here relative to the 2080, thanks to the extra VRAM. But this here is why a lot of people were claiming up to a 100% performance gain over the 2080 after seeing Digital Foundry's Nvidia promo video. The data is accurate, but without more information it can also be a bit misleading. And here is more information. By leaving all the options on Ultra Nightmare, with the exception of the texture pool size, which I've dropped to Ultra, reducing VRAM usage to 7GB, this is what we find. There's no real change in performance with GPUs packing 10GB or more of VRAM, but for those with 8GB like the RTX 2080, we're seeing a 26% performance uplift, and that means the 3080 is now 70% faster, not 115% faster. We'll talk more about this soon, but for now, let's move on to Wolfenstein Youngblood. Starting with the 1440p data, we see that the RTX 3080 is good for 242 FPS on average, as it boosted performance over the 2080 Ti by a 22% margin and 55% over the 2080. So fairly typical gains there for 1440p. Now at 4K, we're looking at 142 FPS on average with the 3080, which is extremely impressive, though that meant it was again just 22% faster than 2080 Ti, so by no means the biggest margins we've seen. It also meant that the 3080 was 60% faster than the 2080, which is a pretty solid gain really. Finally, we have the Hitman 2 results, and this is another rare instance where the Ryzen 9 3950X does limit performance at 1440p, and as a result, the RTX 3080 is just 5% faster than the 2080 Ti. That said, don't expect to see 20% or greater margins with an Intel processor. Using the 10900K, for example, the 3080 was just 10% faster at this resolution. So the gains in Hitman 2 at 1440p are very minimal compared to what we've seen elsewhere. Increasing the resolution to 4K really does help out the 3080, as here it was 29% faster than the 2080 Ti and 69% faster than the 2080. So once again, we're really seeing the Ampere GPU come to life at the 4K resolution. Okay, so depending on what kind of expectations you might have had coming into this, some of these results may have been a bit disappointing, let's say, while others could have been genuinely impressive. Truth is, the margins were a bit all over the place, so let's have a look at the 14-game average for all the GPUs tested, and then we'll do a few head-to-head comparisons looking at individual titles. Starting with the 1440p data, we see that on average across the 14 games tested, the RTX 3080 was 21% faster than the 2080 Ti and 49% faster than the 2080. It was also 58% faster than the 1080 Ti and 113% faster than the vanilla 1080. So what all this means is we're looking at roughly a 50% performance boost at the $700 price point after 2 years, at least for 1440p gaming. The 4K data is certainly more favourable, as here the RTX 3080 was on average 32% faster than the 2080 Ti, 71% faster than the RTX 2080, and 77% faster than the GTX 1080 Ti. Those really are far more impressive gains, and it is a bit unfortunate that the margins weren't quite as impressive at the more popular 1440p resolution. Just quickly, if we remove the 115% performance gain the RTX 3080 enjoyed in Doom Eternal using the Ultra Nightmare textures, and instead swap in the Ultra texture results, we don't see that much of a change. The 3080 is now 69% faster than the 2080 at 4K, whereas we just saw with the 115% win in Doom, it was 71% faster on average, so just a 2% change in overall data. Now, here's a look at the margins on a per game basis, and please note, due to the way this data is calculated, there can be a small discrepancy in the totals when comparing to the average results we just saw. Anyway, as seen previously, the 3080 is 21% faster than 2080 Ti at 1440p, and here we see performance margins range anywhere from a few percent right up to 33%. So how much extra performance you'll see over a part like the 2080 Ti at 1440p will really depend on the game, and while that's really always true, it's more so here than normal. For example, we see far more predictable margins at 4K, and this has little to do with the CPU used and much more to do with the Ampere architecture. Again, I'll discuss this in more detail soon, but what we're seeing here is gains of at least 22%, with the biggest margins seen in Horizon Zero Dawn, where the 3080 was up to 43% faster. Then, when compared to the RTX 2080, we're again seeing performance that's really all over the place at 1440p, with margins as small as 25% and then as big as 69%, and there's no real indication of what's normal or to be expected, as results are, as I said, really all over the place. Yet we do find far more consistent performance at the 4K resolution. Yes, there is still a big difference between 51 and 83%, but looking at the data, you could get away with expecting on average around 70% more performance. And please note that I went with the 7GB VRAM data for Doom here, as the 115% gain using the Ultra Nightmare preset is a massive outlier right now and not indicative of raw GPU performance. Even when compared to the 1080 Ti at 1440p, the margins are just all over the place. You could be looking at just 26 to 34% more performance, or you could be looking at 76 to 87% more performance. So the 55% average, while accurate, isn't really a good ballpark for what you can expect to see in a given title. Again, the margins are a little more predictable at 4K, though in compute-heavy titles, you're looking at some pretty massive performance gains over Pascal GPUs. Now let's take a look at power consumption, starting with our total system consumption numbers, which take into account absolutely everything in the computer. So this is power drawn from the wall. So again, literally everything inside the PC is being measured here. And this is useful for a few reasons. Firstly, it lets you know roughly what kind of power supply you'd need for a certain configuration. It also lets you know just how much difference in power draw there is between, say, a 2080 Ti and 3080 when factoring in the entire system. In this instance, we're looking at a pretty big 21% increase in total system usage as the RTX 3080 pushes our test system up to 523 watts. That's well beyond what we saw with even the GTX 1080 Ti or Vega 64. So while certainly very fast, the RTX 3080 does suck down a lot of power. Using Nvidia's PCAT or Power Capture Analysis tool, we can accurately measure the power draw of just the graphics card, including not only what it draws from the PCIe power connectors, but also the PCIe slot. It's a seriously impressive tool, and I would like to just thank Nvidia for providing it to reviewers. That was very cool of them. Here we can see that the RTX 3080 does consume 25% more power than the 2080 Ti and 29% more than the RTX 2080. So while that is a lot of power, it is technically more efficient. And proving that, we have some performance per watt figures taken from our 4K Doom Eternal test using the 7GB textures, which don't cripple 8GB cards like the RTX 2080. Here we're seeing that the RTX 3080 does offer the most performance per watt, so you can't deny its efficiency, though having said that, you'd probably be hoping for more than an 8% improvement over Turing from a node shrink. Now, for testing thermal performance of the RTX 3080 Founders Edition graphics card, I've installed it in our Corsair Obsidian 500D test system and let it run for an hour in F1 2020 while maintaining a room temperature of 21 degrees. After which point the GPU peaked at just 77 degrees and maintained a core clock frequency of around 1830 MHz. This saw the graphics card fans spin at up to 1900 RPM, where they could be heard, but they weren't overly loud. Unfortunately though, I don't have any scientific sound measurements right now, but still I found the FE model very good, and given the performance and power draw, I was pleasantly surprised. That said, I should note that it does squeal quite a lot when pumping out over 300 FPS, so if you are sensitive to coil whine type noises, a frame cap will be in order. Now, perhaps the most important metric of them all is cost per frame, and at $700 US, the RTX 3080 will be delivering the goods. You all know that we really liked the value that the 5700 XT offered, and here we're seeing despite offering a 64% performance boost, the 3080 is able to roughly match the cost per frame of the Navi-based GPU. So pretty impressive stuff there. It's also 33% cheaper per frame when compared to the RTX 2080. However, if we look at the 4K performance, the cost per frame gets even better. Here the RTX 3080 is the most affordable graphics card released in the last 4 years when it comes to cost per frame, beating even the base model RX 5700. Now here's a quick look at DLSS and ray tracing performance in Wolfenstein Youngblood, and please note that I will have a much more detailed analysis of these technologies in a dedicated video on the channel in a few days' time. For now though, we see when enabling ray tracing, the RTX 3080 suffers a 38% performance hit, which is better than the 46% performance hit the 2080 Ti suffers. Then if we enable DLSS with ray tracing, the 3080 drops just 20% of its original performance, which is marginally better than the 25% drop we see with the 2080 Ti. So in that regard, they aren't really that much different. The RTX 3080 is just faster to begin with. When just using DLSS on its own, we saw a 16% performance boost, which really isn't that much different to the 12% boost we saw from the 2080 Ti. So let's take a look at the 4K data. Here the RTX 3080 was good for 142 FPS when running at the native resolution without any RTX features enabled. Enabling ray tracing did reduce performance by 41% to 84 FPS on average, which is very reasonable performance at 4K, but it is also still a massive FPS drop. For comparison, the RTX 2080 Ti saw a 49% drop, so not a huge difference there in the margins. The same is also true when using DLSS. The 2080 Ti saw an 18% performance boost, whereas the 3080 saw a 23% performance boost. So really, for the most part, it looks like the 3080 is faster at stuff like ray tracing because it's a faster GPU, not because the second gen RT cores are massively improved. Anyway, we have much more ray tracing and DLSS testing to do, so this is certainly not our final conclusion on these technologies with Ampere. Now, something that I talked about quite a bit in the lead up to the GeForce 30 series was its use of PCI Express 4.0, and it was part of the reason why we switched to an AMD Ryzen test system. I did have the RTX 3090 more in mind for this, but I'm also keen to see how PCIe 4.0 helps out the RTX 3070 at 4K, given it only has 8GB of VRAM. But in the meantime, here are the 3080 results. Basically, PCIe 4.0 support makes little difference for the RTX 3080 right now. That could change in the future, but for now at least you're looking at no difference at 4K and about a 3% improvement at 1080p. So for now it's not really worth worrying about, and that was likely going to be the case. The truth is, there are a number of reasons why we switched from Intel to AMD, all of which were outlined in those videos discussing the change. But a big reason was the fact that at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. It won't influence the end result or manipulate stuff like cost per frame. For example, here we're looking at how the 3950X and 10900K compare with the RTX 3080 and 2080 Ti at 1440p across our 14 game sample. The 10900K was 4% faster with the 2080 Ti and 6% faster with the 3080. That 2% isn't going to skew the results. Then at 4K we see there's no difference to speak of, as both CPUs push the RTX 3080 to the same 108 FPS on average. So as I said back then, it really shouldn't matter which CPU a reviewer chooses to use, as they should come to the same conclusion with either CPU when reviewing the RTX 3080. Well, there you have it, the RTX 3080 in a nutshell. I've got a lot more benchmarks that I want to show you guys, and certainly a lot more that I want to run, but I think for now we do have a pretty good idea of what's on offer here. But before I start to break down the data and analyze the RTX 3080, please note that I don't want to overhype it, but I also don't want to downplay it either. That said, I feel like Nvidia has set themselves up a bit here, especially with the content they ran on the Digital Foundry channel right after the announcement. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in all of that, but I feel it is important to mention, especially given how we know so many of you were expecting to see 80% gains over the RTX 2080 as the norm, and that's certainly a bit of a disconnect from reality given that we only saw 2 examples of 80% gains at 4K, one of them being due to a VRAM limitation in Doom Eternal, though that might have also been the case with Horizon Zero Dawn. Still, a 70% performance uplift on average over the RTX 2080 4K is obviously very impressive, and a huge improvement in cost per frame, so well done there by Nvidia. However, an area of concern for me was the inconsistent 1440p performance that saw the RTX 3080 beat the 2080 by as much as 70%, but also by as little as 25%, and in the end we saw just shy of a 50% performance gain on average. Now, a 50% performance gain is still great to see, admittedly though it's not super amazing given that it's over a 2-year period, and really it has been 3.5 years since the GTX 1080 Ti was released, but it is also a lot better than anything else we've received at the high end in that same time period. Before digging into that, let's talk about the somewhat underwhelming 1440p results, at least relative to what we saw at 4K. Why was the RTX 3080 performance inconsistent at 1440p and overall much lower than what we saw at 4K? The reason is mostly down to the Ampere architecture and the change to the SM configuration that I spoke of at the start of the video. The 2x FP32 design can really only be fully utilized at 4K and beyond, and this is because at 4K, the portion of the render time per frame is heavier on FP32 shaders. At lower resolutions like 1440p for example, the vertice and triangle load is identical to what we see at 4K, but at the higher resolution, pixel shaders and computer effects shaders are much more intensive, so take longer and therefore can fill the SM's FP32 ALUs better. That said, we do often see high-performance GPUs better utilized at higher resolutions for similar reasons, so that in itself isn't that unusual. Higher resolutions always do a better job of putting core-heavy GPUs to work, and they also help minimize other system bottlenecks. The 2080 Ti, for example, extends its lead over the 2080 at 4K as well, going from 23% faster at 1440p to 28% faster at 4K, and that's with the lower quality textures in Doom. That said, we're only talking about a 5% performance discrepancy here, and the scaling at 1440p and 4K does look very similar, and the 3950X can also be blamed for a small part of the difference. With the RTX 3080, we're talking about a 21% margin over the 2080 Ti at 1440p, and then a much larger 32% margin at 4K, and VRAM plays no role in that difference. As I said, the issue is largely with the Ampere architecture, which is a compute-heavy data center and AI architecture, not a gaming architecture. I do wonder if Nvidia has shot themselves a little bit in the foot here. That said, it's probably not going to matter too much, given that I do expect any stock that they have on hand to just fly out the door the second these things go on sale. But for those of you who were expecting gains of 80%, seeing just shy of 50% on average at 1440p is probably going to be a bit disappointing. And for me, it's the 1440p data that really was a bit of a letdown. And that really is entirely because of expectations set by Nvidia and their insistence of showing a best case scenario, and then worse still, using Digital Foundry's credibility to push those marketing claims, making them appear highly credible, which convinced many gamers they were getting an 80% performance improvement at the $700 US price point. So in reality, most 2080 owners are going to be looking at, on average, a 50% performance boost, as I suspect a good many of you are targeting high refresh rate 1440p and not 4K gaming. The fact that the 3080 excels at 4K gaming is also a little bit unfortunate given Nvidia only paired it with 10GB of VRAM. And I'm just guessing here, but I suspect in a year or two you might start running into the same kind of issues we see in Doom Eternal with 8GB cards at 4K, using the maximum textures. The game still runs fine, but there is a performance penalty to pay, though PCIe 4.0 will be a lot more useful in mitigating those performance losses. Anyway, blocking out any expectations you or I might have had, a 50% performance boost on average at 1440p is still very good, at least relative to the GeForce 20 series. We only have to look at the cost per frame data to see that the RTX 3080 is a massive improvement over the RTX 2080 in terms of value, and it's even better value than the RTX 2060 and comparable to the RX 5700 XT. That being the case, I think that in the current market, the GeForce RTX 3080 is an excellent value product, but it has obviously been helped by an overpriced GeForce 20 series. Actually, here's a bit of an example. I feel the RTX 2080 Ti should have cost $700 US, $800 at the very most. But let's say it was $700. It would have offered GTX 1080 Ti owners 30% more performance for the same money, and that would have actually made it a more significant upgrade than the 3080 over the $700 2080 Ti, which only nets you about 20% more performance at 1440p. So that's very interesting to think about, but ultimately it doesn't change anything, as the 2080 Ti unfortunately didn't cost $700. In fact, it didn't really even cost the promised $1,000 for AIB cards, but instead sold for more like $1,200 US. Therefore, once again, we'll be pinning our hopes for a more competitive GPU market on AMD. So fingers crossed, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. But I do feel as though Nvidia has given them an opportunity to strike back with a gamer-focused architecture, but we'll just have to wait and see on that one. As for ray tracing and DLSS, while performance does look a lot better, and again we'll explore that in a dedicated video soon, my opinion hasn't really changed on that stuff, and again the game list's just far too limited. But I am glad to see that it hasn't been used as a key selling point of these new Ampere GPUs. It's now just a nice bonus, and I'll talk more about that in an upcoming video, as I said. Lastly, we have the issue of power consumption, and this is a bit of a weakness of the new GeForce 30 series, but ultimately, I'm not quite sure yet how much it really matters. Most of you already will have a 750 watt or better power supply, and that really is plenty for running an RTX 3080. Also, although we are yet to look at any AIB models, I'm happy to report that Nvidia's Founders Edition ran cool and quiet, especially given the performance. But we're not really seeing much of an improvement in efficiency. But again, I don't think that's going to spoil the experience for gamers in any way, so it's hard to say how much that matters right now. Overall, I'd say that I am very pleased with what the GeForce RTX 3080 is delivering at the $700 price point. It's a hell of a lot better than what we got with the last generation. Personally, I would not have bought an RTX 2080, but I would buy an RTX 3080. Though I'd probably hold off a little bit just to see what AMD has to offer. You might be forced to do that anyway. I've heard there is very limited stock available and retailers are expecting to sell out instantly. Anyway, while you guys hit refresh on your browsers and scramble to try and buy one of these things, I'm going to end this video and carry on with a lot more benchmarking that I want to do. So that is going to do it for this one. If you enjoyed this, what I hope was a detailed benchmark review of the RTX 3080, then give it one of those. Subscribe because there's a lot more things we want to look at. We've got an in-depth AMD versus Intel CPU comparison with this thing, so you can see those results, how they differ in certain games under certain conditions. PCI Express stuff. We'll probably do a in-depth analysis of the cooling performance of the FE card compared to AIB cards. There will be an AIB review of at least one card tomorrow night on the channel, so make sure you see that. That should be quite interesting. I'll be comparing the performance of the FE card with the AIB card that I have on hand. As I sort of film this, I'm not sure how many AIB cards I'll have, but I should have at least one. Anyway, enough from me. You can support us on Patreon. Join us there if you want to. We're going to be doing a live stream tomorrow night at roughly this time, probably an hour after this video went live. Tim and myself will be discussing this card, obviously, and addressing any questions from our Patreon members live. So if you're interested in that, jump over to our Patreon page. You'll also get access to stuff like our Discord chat, behind the scenes videos, Q&As, all that cool stuff. So check it out if you are interested. If not, perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this long RTX 3080 video. Thank you very much for that. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.